Hi, I'm Amy McGann, Director of Social Responsibility at Global Seafood Alliance. Thank you for joining our webinar on responsible recruitment, ending worker-paid recruitment fees. During this webinar, I'll provide a brief overview of GSA's work in this space. Stronger Together will provide information on responsible recruitment, how the employer pays principle fits in, and the role of actors along the supply chain to advance efforts to end worker-paid recruitment fees. And finally, we'll hear from Impactt on what to do if recruitment fees are found to have been paid by workers. So just a few housekeeping items. All participants are muted. You'll receive a recording of this presentation by email. During the webinar, if questions come to mind, please add them in the chat box. And at the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Global Seafood Alliance advances responsible seafood practices worldwide through education, advocacy, and demonstration. And by demonstration, we mean our BAP and BSP certifications. We have standards for feed mill, hatchery, farm, and processing plant on the aquaculture side, and vessels and processing plants on the wild capture side. We also offer the enhanced social accountability audit for plants, and this is, as far as we know, the only seafood-specific social compliance audit. All of the standards have a social responsibility pillar, and as we update the standards, which is a regular process, new requirements get added, and the employer pays principle is one of those. The employer pays principle is the principle that states employers, not workers, should pay recruitment fees. We care a lot about this issue because if workers pay fees before they start a job, they are less likely to feel comfortable raising issues if their labor rights are being abused, and in some circumstances could be in a situation of forced labor. So we have no fees paid by worker requirements in our responsible fishing vessel standard. In our seafood processing standard, as of January 1st, we've required the employer pays principle. And in our newest seafood processing standard 6.0, which will be required as of November, we will be requiring the employer pays principle and reimbursement of fees if they have been paid by workers. So we're thrilled to be joined by Stronger Together and Impactt, who have a lot of experience on responsible recruitment, the employer pays principle, and what to do if workers have paid fees. We'll now be hearing from Veronica and Tori from Stronger Together. Stronger Together is an impact-driven, not-for-profit, providing businesses with practical training, resources, business services, and collaborative programs. They work across 3 continents within multiple sectors to achieve their vision of a world where all workers are recruited responsibly and have fair work free from exploitation. So over to you, Veronica.
Thank you for that introduction, Amy, and for giving us the opportunity to join you today. Can you hear me okay? I see, okay, I can only see Tori, but I get a thumbs up, so I think we're good. So my name is Veronica Ospina. I work with Stronger Together US and Mexico, and I am joined by my colleague, Tori Culbero. And as Amy mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about what is responsible recruitment, how is it defined, what is the employer pays principle or EPP, and what are those fees when we're talking about a worker paying recruitment fees? What do those look like? So Amy already shared a little bit about us, our vision, and our mission. And the important thing to highlight here is that we're a business-friendly and business-focused organization, and we work together with businesses up and down the supply chain to help them embed responsible recruitment and fair labor practices into their supply chain operations, in order to make sure that labor exploitation and forced labor are avoided and mitigated in operations. Here are some of the countries in which we work in. And as mentioned, Tori and I focus on the Americas in a number of commodities, including seafood, agriculture, and consumer goods. How we launched in 2019, the Stronger Together US program, although Stronger Together as an organization has been around globally for over 10 years. And this is a slide that kind of really briefly shows how we work with businesses. We work with businesses in a number of ways. We work with by developing tools and guidance, resources, briefs, implementation types of tools, checklists. We have training. We also run national forums on responsible recruitment and fair labor practices. We also have a certification program for labor providers, and also, of course, tailored bespoke services to the businesses that we engage with. So getting now into the meat of this portion of the webinar. So we believe that good work starts with responsible recruitment. What do we mean by responsible recruitment? As an organization, we define responsible recruitment meaning that all workers are lawfully recruited in a fair and transparent manner that respects and protects their rights through the entire recruitment process. And that includes recruitment, work, and post-termination. A lot of times when we think, responsible recruitment, we're thinking that that's maybe just the first mile and the first experience for the worker. And it certainly does include that. As Amy said earlier, if you don't get recruitment right, there's a real risk that there will be other issues that come up throughout the employment process. So while we do certainly focus on the recruitment piece, particularly when we're talking about migrant labor, we're talking about the full cycle, life cycle of the work experience for workers and migrant workers. So what does that recruitment look like? When do they have contracts? Are they written in a language they understand? Are they transparent? Are the terms clear? Including pay, transportation. And then once they get to the work site, are all those terms that were presented in the recruitment and in the contracts, are they being fulfilled properly? And then are the workers returning to their communities? That's what we mean kind of by post-termination. It's kind of the return to the community of origin. So making sure that that is always done lawfully, fairly, and transparently. At Stronger Together, we kind of view responsible recruitment and fair labor practices. We acknowledge and view that it is a spectrum. On the left here, we have kind of those red areas, labor trafficking, forced labor, child labor. And then we move to kind of unethical and labor exploitation, and then moving to the green and blue sections, which, our ultimate kind of goal is to help businesses move to this blue section, and to, as much as we can, support businesses to implement responsible recruitment and fair work practices, and then to be able to demonstrate that to workers and to clients. So within Stronger Together, we have a number of standards, 14 standards that help us reach responsible recruitment and fair labor practices. Today, we will be focusing on standard number 3, which is no recruitment fees, and how that relates to the employer pays principle. There are a number of key drivers as to why businesses should activate responsible recruitment. We feel pretty confidently that if you are on this webinar today and you're listening and you're participating, then you likely understand some of the drivers and already are building these drivers into your businesses. But we want to kind of highlight some of the reasons. These are not all inclusive as to why responsible recruitment is important. But of course, it's putting people first, putting people at the heart of your business, ensuring ethical and fair treatment for workers. We want to meet industry expectations. We want to meet legal requirements, avoiding pitfalls, building a stable workforce. We want to make sure that we can attract and retain workers. And it's all really about building resilient and sustainable systems and remaining competitive in the market. Here is a quick snapshot, an example of some businesses, trade associations, and nonprofit organizations that have made public commitments to responsible recruitment in recent years and have also made public commitments to the employer pays principle. Here we're focused on some US retailers, but also some Stronger Together sponsors that you might recognize that are active in the EU and across the globe. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tori, who is going to really dig deep into what the employer pays principle says and what it means to meet those requirements.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Veronica. So we can dive into what EPP is. So essentially, employer pays principle is a global ethical recruitment standard, which establishes that no worker should pay for a job. The cost of recruitment should be borne not by the worker, but the employer. So it's a commitment that recognizes that recruitment costs money, and of everyone in a supply chain or business, it asserts that the employer is best positioned to pay recruitment fees rather than an individual who has not even started their job or had an opportunity to gain a meaningful income. So traditionally, these fees were passed on to the employees, but EPP shifts the burden to the employer. Society noted that the practice of worker paid recruitment fees is heavily linked to forced labor and debt bondage. Debt bondage represents 20% of labor trafficking cases. And debt bondage, by the way, is when someone is forced to work to repay a debt, often under exploitative conditions where the debt is impossible to pay off and may even be inherited across generations. So remember that individuals may agree to pay recruitment fees even when they can't reasonably pay them off. They can take on fees because they need the job to support their livelihoods, their families, or they may have even faced coercion or threats. So EPP in many ways is a preventative practice. Forced labor, by the way, just to set the context, is so pervasive globally that no region is immune. It's safe to say that if businesses aren't taking intentional steps to prevent and mitigate forced labor, it will likely become an issue, particularly if your business is linked to a commodity like seafood, where the presence of forced labor is well documented. So I'll speak about the US context because that's where I'm based, although I know we have folks from around the world here. But trafficking has appeared in U.S. vessels, processing plants, you name it. Workers on temporary H-2B visas are particularly vulnerable. These visas are used across many industries, but seafood is one of the sectors where risks are elevated. And among H-2B visa holders surveyed in a Polaris Project report from a few years back, they found that 853 people who had experienced labor trafficking, about 70% of them said that their wages had been withheld, which is an indicator of coercion and control. And I know that the US is not alone in facing these types of challenges. So that being said, let's unpack what constitutes a recruitment fee. So I ask that you think to yourself for a second, what is a recruitment fee? What could be entailed? It'll kind of help, and you can see how you do against our definition. But there are 3 areas that we ask that you keep in mind. It's recruitment fees, related costs to those recruitment fees, and illegitimate, unreasonable, and undisclosed costs. So we'll go further into each of those 3 items. Okay, so recruitment fees come in different masks. Recruitment fees apply regardless if the recruitment is of a domestic worker, a foreign worker, regardless of who is doing the charging, could potentially be charged by different stakeholders, a recruiter, an employer, or any actor, regardless if the fees are one-time or reoccurring. All of this is to say, all of these bullet points is that recruitment fees can take many different forms, but they are prohibited. Okay, related cost. So when I asked you to keep in mind what might constitute a recruitment fee, some of these may have come to mind for you. These are some associated costs that also are prohibited. So medical costs, for instance, immunizations, physical examinations, insurance, equipment costs, that could be tools, safety equipment, travel costs, so on and so forth. I think the important phrase here is at the top, initiated by employer and required to secure employment. So there are bounds of reason within the employer pays principle. If a worker, for instance, decides to take a certification course that the employer isn't asking for and it's not required to secure employment, that might not be a reasonable fee for the employer to pick up. So it has to be initiated by the worker or required to secure employment. Sometimes we get questions around that. And then this last section is around illegitimate, unreasonable, and undisclosed costs. And that includes bribes, tributes, extortion, bonds, illicit cost recovery fees, all prohibited and also not acceptable. Our colleagues at Impactt will be covering best practices and actions. So this slide is not really meant to be an exhaustive list, but the main takeaway here is that the employer pays principle, even though it has the word employer in it, it is a supply chain commitment. So there's a role to play despite your position on the supply chain. It might look a little different, but EPP is not just about employers, regardless if you're a brand, processor, vessel, recruit, so on and so forth. There are shared responsibilities. Almost everyone should be, oh, did my slide change? Here we go. Okay. Yeah, almost everyone should be creating a no recruitment fee policy, for instance, establishing effective grievance mechanisms. Those that work more closely with workers, like vessels or processors, might have heavier responsibilities on worker trainings, whereas brands, your trainings will be more focused on suppliers. So again, if you take anything away from the slide, sorry, I keep shifting, but if you take anything away from this shifting slide, it's that you likely have some kind of role to play if you're on the webinar, I'm guessing. Okay, just 2 more before we pass it on to Amy, but particularly on the last slide that I showcased, it had a lot of steps and it can be difficult to navigate what exactly you should do next. So we just want to say that we are here to help. We do have resources to support deepen your knowledge. We've only just scratched the surface. And even after this webinar, we'll only be covering a few things in the brief time that we have together. But there are some very important deep dives that we do on our in-house training. So we offer, for instance, like a 2-hour training on recruitment fees alone, on grievance mechanisms, due diligence on your business partners, and they're applicable to brands, employers, recruiters, you name it. And you can even suggest it to your business partners as well. We also have a number of free resources on our site that can help with some of the steps that I had on the last slide. Guidance, policy templates, checklists. If you ever do download them for free, feel free to reach out to us and let us know if they were helpful, how you've used them. We're always looking for case studies and just to hear from everyone. And the last slide here is on our responsible recruitment toolkit. It's a great interactive self-assessment that walks subscribers step by step on how to take action towards responsible recruitment. So it covers the 14 areas that Veronica had touched on in our responsible recruitment standards. And one of those areas, as you saw, was worker paid recruitment fees. So for each step that the subscriber is walking through, so let's say the step is establishing a commitment. Sometimes folks don't know what to do. So there is guidance, there's instructions under each one. It's very much a capacity building tool. We find that folks find it helpful before preparing for an audit, especially because it is aligned with international standards, best practice, laws. And there's filters for different audits as well for those that want to concentrate on specific criteria within the self-assessment. So that's the responsible recruitment toolkit. And with that, I will pass it to Amy.
Thank you, Veronica and Tori. Now that we have an understanding of responsible recruitment, the employer pays principle, and what counts as recruitment fees and related costs, we'll now hear from Ben and Priyanka from Impactt about what to do if workers have paid fees. Impactt is a leading employee-owned consultancy that specializes in ethical trade and human rights. They have decades of experience supporting their clients to identify and tackle human rights risks across their business in a way that positively impacts the workers in their supply chains and local communities. And critically for this discussion, they have developed the leading guidance on repayment of recruitment fees. I'll pass it over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for asking us to present on this webinar today. We will be kind of presenting on what to do if recruitment fees or related costs are found. So just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Priyanka Kanani. I'm the head of food and agriculture at Impactt, which is a business and human rights consultancy based in London. And I'm joined by my colleague, Ben, who is the head of technical and quality. Just to quickly introduce Impactt to those who don't know us, as Amy mentioned, we're a kind of purpose-driven employee-owned consultancy specializing in business and human rights. Founded in 1997, we have over 25 years of experience helping businesses to succeed, whilst also improving the lives of workers and local communities. At Impactt, we do things differently. We have a core value of putting the worker at the center of everything we do. And we have extensive experience of actually being on the ground, conducting field assessments in various sectors, including food and agriculture, where we've done a lot of work in the seafood industry and various other kind of agricultural commodities, etc. as well, where we've been able to kind of uncover complex human rights issues and blind spots for companies. And because of this, we built up kind of deep expertise and understanding of the nuances within the food and agricultural sector. And not only do we possess that kind of on the ground experience and expertise, but we also understand commercial realities for businesses at a more strategic level. So we work with different kind of actors across the supply chain. So one key kind of service offering we provide is around remediation. So we've worked on large-scale recruitment fee repayment projects across the world. As you can see on the slide, there's a couple of examples up. So this includes work in Singapore, Qatar, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Maldives, and Malaysia, where we've helped to repay over $126 million to over 70,000 workers. I thought it would be interesting to kind of showcase a couple of examples of work we've done before diving into the principles and guidelines. So one big project we did was with Sime Darby Plantation, which is a palm oil producer in Malaysia, which was subject to an import ban in the US due to allegations of forced labor in its operations. So Impactt was appointed as the third-party advisor to conduct a kind of comprehensive assessment of their labor practices against the ILO's 11 forced labor indicators. And we did this through field assessments across its Malaysian operations. So our work with them spanned for a 2-year period and included interviewing more than 1,000 migrant workers during the investigation stage, and then ongoing kind of bespoke remediation where we supported on issues including ethical recruitment and repayment. So through our work, we supported them in repaying over 17.3 million US dollars in recruitment fees to its workers. And then another example is some work we're currently doing at a fishery in the Maldives, where we kind of assessed migrant worker recruitment fees and have provided recommendations on mitigations and kind of remediations for next steps. So through our investigation, we found that 95% of the workers we interviewed reported paying recruitment fees, and that varied from, a couple $100 or several $100s to several $1,000s, depending on the nationality of where the worker came from. So as a result, we kind of developed a report which outlined recommendations on remediation, which included as a priority kind of a repayment program to repay those workers. So we worked with the site to establish that, and within that plan included kind of the scope of workers to be paid, the payment schedule, what the timeline is going to be, and really importantly, the kind of comms plan to ensure workers understand what the kind of plan was, what was going on, etc. We also then tried to contact kind of former and current workers to understand, their bank details and verify who they are and do all of that stuff to support the site and actually making the payments to the right workers in a secure way. And so far, more than $500,000 in recruitment fees has been repaid at the site. I'm going to hand over to Ben to introduce our principles and guidelines for the repayment of migrant worker recruitment fees and related costs.
Thanks, Priyanka, and hi, everyone. So all the work that Priyanka has just been speaking about in terms of repaying recruitment fees, that goes back quite a long way for Impactt, so about at least 10 years. And all of that ground level work, which kind of really grew in earnest with our project in Qatar for the FIFA World Cup, which involved repayment to 30,000 workers. That all of this helped to inform a set of principles and guidelines that we developed with the help of about 200 different entities, all providing feedback into this. So from private companies to country governments, international organizations, were all feeding back into this kind of document, which has a set of principles around what investigation and repayment and remediation should look like, as well as step-by-step guidelines on how to go through this whole process. It's very much underpinned by the UN GPs and aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance. It has been informed, as we said, by all of the repayment that we've actually done in the field, both the investigation side and the repayment itself. Very long, drawn out, multi-year processes of consultation and 5 or 6 different rounds. I think we're currently on version 6 or 7 of this set of principles and guidelines. So it's constantly growing and adapting based on field application. And it's now been adopted and endorsed by the Consumer Goods Forum and AIM Progress. So that's a 400 member coalition. And there's various international agencies who are adopting this as good practice as well. So you'll see this referenced in a number of key documents that we can share in due course. I'll hand back to Priyanka to just give a brief introduction to the principles and guidelines at a high level before I go into a bit more detail.
Thanks, Ben. So there are kind of 6 key sort of core principles behind the recruitment fees guidelines. And the first and really important one is around protecting workers, which is at the core of everything that we do. It's really important to ensure confidentiality to workers, to make sure that they feel comfortable to kind of open up and share their experiences without any kind of fear of retaliation from the site or from management. The second is to commit to transparency and disclosure. So it's really important to keep the workers informed about the repayment plan and progress and what they should expect and how they should expect it. The third is to engage in meaningful multi-stakeholder collaboration. To ensure there's different sort of parties involved. The fourth is around ensuring oversight, quality and integrity of the repayment process, which is why there's a lot of thought that goes into that kind of initial repayment plan. The fifth is to kind of provide workers with access to alternative channels for remedy. So when we conduct these programs, we tend to kind of provide a third-party grievance mechanism for workers, so that throughout the repayment process, they have a kind of safe channel to raise any grievances during the kind of repayment process. And the sixth is to integrate shared learning. There's always kind of there can always be continuous improvement. As Ben just mentioned, we keep kind of updating these guidelines depending on what we're finding. So that's a really key kind of point this as well. So our guidance is comprised of kind of 6 key steps, which outline what should be done if recruitment fees are actually found. So the first step is to investigate the recruitment fees and costs paid by workers. So this is to understand the amount actually paid by each worker, broken down by nationality and different kind of recruitment avenues. The second is to identify eligibility for repayment. So this is to understand which workers are actually within scope to be repaid. Now, best practice is that all current and former workers are repaid, but at a minimum, our guidelines suggest that all workers from the date of identification of recruitment fees should be within scope of repayment. The third key step is to calculate the repayment amount, and we have kind of outlined what that looks like and this kind of takes into account a lot of different variables, including the currency the payment was made in, the year, kind of inflation rates, interest rates, the opportunity cost of where that money could have been sort of kept in that time, etc. The fourth step is the kind of timeline for repayment. So when will the workers be repaid? How will they be repaid? Will it be in a one-time payment or over a certain period of time? What will that look like? The fifth is to engage and communicate with migrant workers. So this repayment plan should be communicated to the workers clearly. So including, the payment amount, the timeline, where they can access grievance mechanisms, etc. So they're kept up to date and there's kind of transparency around that process. And the sixth one is, the payment should be verified by a credible third party to check whether workers are paid as per the repayment plan. Now I'll hand over to Ben to dive deeper into the guidance.
Thanks, Priyanka. So great summary there for those who need to shoot off, but I'll go a bit deeper into these guidelines now. I'll try and do this in the next 6 minutes or so to save plenty of time for questions. I've also got a few FAQs lined up just after these 6 slides as well. But first of all, what the investigation itself should look like. So it can be done as an internal investigation to what once it's known that recruitment fees have been paid or that they exist. It depends whether the staff on site have full transparency and if they are trusted to dig properly into these issues. We'd always recommend interviewing a representative sample of workers, ideally 20% of the workforce. It should always cover all nationalities, genders, any other kind of cohort breakdown that is on site should be included. And at best practice, you'd be interviewing 100% of the workers or as close to that as possible. And generally, you'd want a independent third party to carry out the investigation. So depending on the situation, that's how you might slightly change who is doing the investigation and how wide scale the investigation is. The second step, identifying eligibility. So as a minimum standard, we would repay all migrant workers who are employed on what we call a date of first diagnosis. So this date is somewhat arbitrarily chosen, but the source of choice for this date is based on a date at which it is irrefutable that people knew that recruitment fees existed. So it might be a media expose, the headline of a paper. It might be an actual audit that happened at the site, or it might be that the company introduced a zero fees policy on that date. Whichever of those dates was the furthest back, that's called the date of first diagnosis. And workers who were listed as an employee on that date are therefore eligible for repayment, because on that date, the company had no reason not to know that they had paid recruitment fees. So as best practice, we would extend this definition to include all current and former migrant workers that paid fees, regardless of whether they were recruited before or whether they were working before or after that date of first diagnosis. And then calculations. This is the slightly more complex step. So this involves some use of historic exchange rates. So when we're doing the investigation, we want to understand from the workers how much they paid in their home currency. We'll then convert that using historic exchange rates, peg it to the US dollar, add year-on-year inflation for every year since they have paid the money, and then convert it back to the currency in which they are paid their wage. And this, we would also adjust with lost opportunity costs, so a small amount of compensation. We suggest about 2% is good practice, given that the workers have been without that money, without that capital, often for many years, and so they haven't, their families haven't had that money to be able to set up a business or run an existing family business, for example. So they haven't been able to make money off that money. So hence why we recommend as good practice to have this compensation added as lost opportunity cost, which goes above and beyond historic exchange rates and inflation, which should be added anyway, just to make the repayment equal to today's real economic value of whatever the worker paid, however many years ago it was. Impactt actually has a calculation model that we've built that kind of calculates all of this automatically, but we also publish exactly how to do this in our principles and guidelines as well. So it's absolutely free access. Then fourthly, the timeline for repayment. This is quite simple. So the repayment should occur as quickly as possible. If it doesn't occur quickly, the risk is that workers remain in a new form of debt bondage, whereby they're actually remaining at their employer, waiting to get these repayments for months and months, or even years and years. And so that actually kind of recreates the problem that it's trying to solve in some ways. So we recommend a lump sum repayment to remove this, to remove any cases of debt bondage or unpaid recruitment fees. But a kind of a maximum of 3 to 9 months, allowing for some negotiation time as well. Fifth, and very importantly, engagement and communication with workers is very important. So making sure that workers receive a formal communication, so a letter that details the reason why they're being repaid, what is going to happen differently in future for new recruits, as well as the timeline for repayment, who they can contact if they have any questions, and the fact that they should not be asked by anyone for any stipend from this payment. The money is solely for them to do with what they want. We can also, as good practice, engage with trade unions and other representatives to make sure that all possible channels for grievance or questions are activated as well. And finally, verifying that payment has indeed been made. This would be done by a credible, experienced independent third party to just make sure that all the payments that the companies have committed to has indeed reached the workers. So this would involve both worker interviews and verification of documentation to show that those payments have gone through. And in future, going onwards, making sure that monitoring activities still happen on an ongoing basis. It is very important to make sure that workers, for example, didn't have to then repay the recruitment fees to the employer, because we came across issues such as this, where subcontractors were paying workers repayment in cash, but were then actually just asking for the money back a few months after the verification occurred. So it's important to keep in contact as well. So that's been a very brief summary of the principles and guidelines for repayment. I'll just finish on this slide, which has a few frequently asked questions, before then handing over to Amy and the team to moderate some of the questions we've been receiving. So thanks very much for those questions so far. But firstly, just to answer a few common ones we get. So what's specific about vessels, in the seafood sector? So we tend to see, because they're out at sea and they're perhaps under different laws or international maritime laws, it can be ambiguous as to what standards to follow. And actually, there can very often just be, there's one captain of the ship and what they say goes. So very much we see higher risks of things like indicators like intimidation and threats, We can see higher levels of coercion, higher levels of coaching, definitely higher levels of isolation, due to this very, isolated geographical situation that the workers sadly find themselves in. So it's very, very important to use highly trained interviewers and assessment teams who are very well versed in seeing through these kinds of transparency barriers. Secondly, repaying former workers is something that came up in advance of this call, and this is something that often gets asked. So, would we include former workers in scope? Yes, if they were employed by the company on that date of first diagnosis that I spoke about. And the way we can do that is by having things called contingency funds. So this is a ring-fenced pot of money, which is governed by a steering committee, and former workers can kind of apply to receive this repayment if they're within this pool of workers that's on a worker list that fits within this date of first diagnosis. We have good experience working with many companies who've done this successfully. It's rare to get 100% hit rate of every single worker on the list because it's hard to get in contact with workers, but some successful outreach programs include adverts in newspapers, going through alumni networks of workers who are still there, and a few other ways as well. And then a question which I think I've seen Harriet also ask, but which I've got on the FAQ is who pays? Ultimately, it comes down to the employer pays principle, which colleagues at Stronger Together have introduced very well. But that's not necessarily to say that the employer fronts all the bill without then passing any of that on. It's very much about building that into their reasonable costs and their quotations that they are providing to buyers. So let's say if ethical recruitment does cost a bit more because workers are no longer allowed to be charged for these things, then that is built in transparently to their quotations in an open tender process. We have a very handy webinar on our website as well that explains the various nuances of what that can look like. And in terms of who actually repays workers, so in terms of the principles and guidelines we've just spoken about, the initial repayment, this may be a combination of equitable burden. So perhaps it's partly the buyer, partly the employer in the initial step to ensure a speedy resolution to the workers who have been wronged and may still be in debt bondage. This also helps to ensure collective buy-in to the process, even if ultimately it becomes about the employer making sure that this is paid before it ever even becomes an issue that the workers have been charged recruitment fees. Then finally, the various funding options exist for doing this, which can be shared throughout the supply chain to fund this, but Impactt has been working on something called a remedy bond with various banks and private equity investors. The idea being that there is a pool of money which can be accessed to repay workers instantly. So it removes the barrier of having the actual capital required to foot the big bill of repaying a large group of workers. That can be done instantly by withdrawing from this bond. And actually, that can then be repaid as a low interest or zero interest loan over a number of years by the company and perhaps by the buyers if they've input some down payment too. This can then be funded through perhaps an increased price per catch or shared throughout the supply chain in some way of future invoicing models that help to make sure that the ultimate employer doesn't then, for instance, need to let go of any workers, because the worst situation would be, if a repayment then bankrupted them or made workers lose their jobs. So it's very important that the whole supply chain works together to make sure that no ill benefits come out of this initial repayment. So that's the end of our slides. I'll hand back over to have some moderated questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ben and Priyanka. And if everyone wants to come on video for the Q&A part, Ben, Priyanka, Veronica, and Tori. And let's see if I know what I'm doing here. I'll just go in order, and I saw that Veronica was answering some of these questions in the Q&A, but I'll ask them in case others have additional thoughts that they'd want to weigh in on. And the first question is actually for GSA: why is the employer pays principal only on processing? Are vessels not at risk also farms? And so no recruitment fees paid by workers is in the processing plant and vessel standard at the moment. And as the farm, hatchery, and feed mill standards get updated, we anticipate that that requirement will be added to those standards as well. Okay. Is there a body of law which requires companies to follow these standards? So I saw Veronica had put some information in the chat. Did anyone want to add anything else on that? Okay, we'll go to the next question.
Oh, sorry. I just read what Veronica said. I think that makes sense. I'm sorry. I was trying to look for her response to make sure I'm not repeating, but I think it's, it's a practice from the mid 2010s. It's very new, employer pays principle. So I think slowly around the world it's being codified into law. Certainly like within the US context, I think we're very much aligned, and I can only speak for the US, sorry. I can't speak for other countries, but like what we do know is that it's for H2A, H2B visas. There is a great deal of alignment between EPP and the seasonal worker visas, which is great because there's a lot of times where our laws aren't in compliance with international standards. And I know in other countries as well, it's kind of slowly reaching that level, but it's going to take time.
Yeah, and just to add to that, from the UK context, the UK law also hasn't caught up to EPP yet either. So, for example, the seasonal worker scheme in agriculture, there's often recruitment fees found for migrant workers coming to work on farms in the UK. And actually, UK law allows for a certain amount of related costs to be charged to the worker, for instance, flight costs, and perhaps visa costs as well. So this, because there is a small window of what can be charged, what actually tends to happen is much bigger lump sums are then charged to workers as well. So it actually will end up costing the worker far more than what flights or visas should cost, simply because it's taking advantage of a vulnerable worker who needs a job. So there's a lot more work to be done. It's currently up for discussion though, so stay tuned.
And that's why in certification schemes and some audit schemes, it's actually a higher requirement than required by national law. Okay, the next question. Why aren't the costs shared? Why is it all on the employer? Ben sort of already answered this, but if anyone else wants to provide any other information. Okay. Oh, Tori.
No, yeah, just I don't know if the question came in after my slide. I would refer, I think this video will be shared. I would refer back to our slide on EPP being a supply chain commitment, because I think it is a really good point. The employer pays principle is a little misleading because it has that word employer. And as Ben said, yeah, initially that is kind of the idea, but it is a built-in commitment in the supply chain. And that is something we want folks to walk away from that whole thing. So that's why we kind of outlined steps that different parties should be considering in their thought process on how to approach employer pays principle.
Thank you. And next question. Would you class passport renewal fees as an associated recruitment cost for foreign workers? Anyone?
So yeah, it's a good question. It varies from standard to standard. Generally, the approach is that if a worker does not have a passport yet, or sorry, a candidate doesn't have a passport yet, and they have been offered a job, and in order to and following the offer of a job, they then need to get a passport to begin that job, then that should generally be covered by the employer, and so it should be paid on behalf of the worker. But if the worker already had a passport, then generally it might fall outside of that. If they already had the passport and were applying for other jobs, then it might be out of scope, for example. In terms of renewal fees, so the worker is already on their job and they need to get their passport renewed in order to maintain their status, then that would be a requirement to continue their employment. So that generally would fall within the scope of what should be covered by the employer.
Thank you. And then, should businesses be expected to see evidence, such as receipts, of fees paid by, I'm assuming that the question is for fees paid by migrant workers when you're considering repayment?
So I can take that one as well, if that's okay. We generally no, not at all, and that I'll add that it's actually very rare for receipts to even exist, even if employers wanted to see them. The reason being is that recruitment agents, both legitimate and illegitimate sub-agents, and any actors through that recruitment chain, will deliberately avoid evidence, especially in the wake of more and more kind of zero cost recruitment drives and, the EPP becoming bigger and bigger, because the evidence is trying to be hidden and swept under the carpet. What we found in 7 years of working in Qatar and interviewing 4,800 workers there, we found that less than 5% of workers who had paid recruitment fees, less than 5% of them had any receipts or evidence whatsoever. And even those workers only had a couple of scraps of evidence around, the odd accommodation they had to pay for, or the odd bus journey they had to pay for. So it certainly wasn't the totality of what they had paid, because all of that was generally done in cash, cash in hand, and no evidence of it having happened, in order to protect those recruitment agents from being found.
Thank you. And then could we have access to the Impactt supporting documentation for remediation of recruitment fees?
Yeah, we're happy to share that and circulate after the webinar. That's not a problem. It's publicly available on our website, so that's fine. We'll be able to share that.
Thank you. And I think that covers all of the questions that we have gotten. So thank you, Priyanka, Ben, Veronica, and Tori, for sharing. I hope that this has been useful as various actors within the seafood supply chain work to advance the employer pays principle. Thank you for joining us. Bye.